Again, I appreciate you all being here. Actually, now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our founding members panel, David Tudor. As David comes to the stage, he's CEO and General Manager of Associated Electric Cooperative in Springfield, Missouri. And prior to that, he was President and CEO of Champion Energy Services in Houston from 2015 through 2016. And of course, you remember him as ACES founding President and CEO from 1999 to 2013. So please join me in welcoming David Tudor, as well as our esteemed panelists.
Good morning. Gentlemen, you want to join me as they're making their way up? I think everyone probably in the audience knows these gentlemen, but just in case you don't remember their names, I've already made that mistake this morning with someone. Tim Reeves, CEO of Southern Illinois. Ed Martin was the former CEO of Wabash Valley. Steve Nelson, the current CEO at Frontier and also the chairman of the board at Buckeye, and Roy Palk, the previous the CEO of East Kentucky Power. Welcome, gentlemen. I'm going to sit down with you. So I must admit, I've actually never been a moderator before. Normally, I'm the one having to answer questions and being embarrassed with my answers. I've also, I worked for these four gentlemen, and so I'm used to them being kind of hard on me. And what's interesting is I get to ask the questions today, and I could cut them off if they talk too long. And so you may see me go, Ed, like this. that means we've heard enough. Same thing with each of them. So on the far end, Tim Reeves and I hadn't seen each other in a long time. It's been a long time. It's good to see you.
5 years.
5 years. So I'm David Tudor. As Mike said, I'm the current CEO of Associated. Hope to be the CEO of Associated for a long time, and very fortunate to be back in the cooperative program. And I succeeded Ed Martin as the interim CEO at ACES back in 1999, and when ACES was first formed. And it was an interesting process. I was asked to come interview for a job, and actually I was a consultant, and the search firm asked me to go to Indiana and interview for this position at ACES. And I said, well, I'm not moving to Indiana. I was living in Austin, Texas. He said, well, just go up and interview with them and tell them you'll consult for them. And they'll hire an internal candidate, and you can, you don't really have to do much. And just get you a consulting gig. And I went up and interviewed and really liked the business model and really liked the people. I really didn't know what a co-op was. And next thing you know, I was there 14 years. So very fortunate to have been with with ACES from the beginning. So I'm gonna ask a few questions today and try and get our panelists to kind of give you some insight as to how ACES actually really got formed and some of the difficulties along the way. So we'll start with you, Steve, and just give us an idea of kind of where the concept, the idea of ACES come from.
Well, for me, it came from Dick Burns, CEO of Buckeye Power. And I was chairman of Buckeye, and he called me up to see if I would go to a meeting in our ECA. And I remember asking him, well, what's the meeting about? And after he told me, I still didn't know what it was. It was kind of confusing. So I flew out, flew back. We went out to a meeting. There was 14 G&Ts there. And actually, I looked up to see if I had any notes, and I did. I found an old legal pad that had some notes on it for 3 pages. And we went to the meeting, and it was about, in my notes, and I remember this, it was customer choice, load aggregation. That was the big deal at the meeting. It was confusing, a lot of ideas. Everybody had their own what we wanted to do, those kind of things. These people on this panel wasn't like this, but I will say, I told Dick when we left, the egos were so large in the room, it was hard to get in. And we had several of those kind of meetings. And at the end, I think that it was the 4 G&Ts that started said, get together. I wasn't part of that. I don't know what I think Tim said it was a conference call. and let's get started. It doesn't look like it's going to make it, by having these meetings, and the four G&Ts that started said, okay, whoever wants to join can, and let's get started with what ended up being ACES.
Thanks, Steve. So Ed, you and Dick Byrne both claim to have started ACES. So who really started ACES?
Well, unfortunately, Dick died, so he can't defend himself. But I know I started it, so I don't have to worry about the rest of this thing. The Wholesale Power Act of 1992 was, to me, the beginning of ACES. Passed by the Congress, and it basically deregulated wholesale power. And if at the time, we were all totally involved in being monopolists. We had up to 50-year contracts with our loads. We had secured territory, and there really wasn't a whole lot to worry about. And so risk was not something that came first to your mind when you talked about the G&T business or the distribution co-op business. But then this Power Act passed, and we didn't know where it was going to go. In 1995, the FPC, I think at the time, came out with regulations to open the market, and the market opened. And suddenly we could go out and we could buy and sell. We'd never been able to do that before. You could do it, but you had to do it on contract. You sat down and got through the misery of negotiating with people who had all the power, and you're sitting there hoping you get by. So when it opened up, the market opened up to such an extent that you could buy from anybody that you could get the power to you from. And we did. At Wabash Valley, we did open up our market, and we began buying and selling. So I'm going to tell you this little bit of story. So I'm sitting up in my conference room having a meeting of some type, and the guy runs into the door and says, "Ed, you got to come downstairs." Well, I didn't know what for, but looked pretty panicky, so I went downstairs. And all the people that buy and sell power were standing up around this telephone. And I said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, Stand Energy failed to deliver, and we're short." I said, "Oh, what does that mean?" It says, "It means we got to fill something in here, and the market's tight to such an extent that there's just nothing out there." I said, "There's got to be something." I said, "Well, there's one old unit over there that I think NCEMC had that they would crank up." I said, "Well, what we got to pay for it?" They said, "Well, the current bid is $1,000 a megawatt." I said, "Wow, that's terrible." And about 2 minutes later, they said, "The next bid is $2,000 a megawatt." That's really terrible. And about 2 minutes later, they came back and said, "It's now $3,000 a megawatt." I said, "That's awful." They came back and said, "It's $4,000 a megawatt." "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" They said, $5,000 a megawatt. And I said, "Buy." So at that point, I knew we were in a risky business. And I can't say that I knew that much before. And we had to find some way to deal with it. And so several of the G&Ts had similar thoughts. I don't know whether they had the similar experience, but they had similar thoughts. And really, we met at NRECA. It wasn't just a conference call. We met at NRECA. You weren't there,
No.
I don't think. But we met at NRECA and had CFC and NRECA with us. And a room full of people. And we tried to figure out what in the world we're going to do. And we said, we don't know what to do. So we said, let's hire a consultant to help us out. So we hired Cooper's Lybrand to help us out. And several G&Ts kicked in some money. CFC kicked in some money. NRECA put in some money, which I thought was unusual, but they did. And we got together $1 million to pay for this study. Well, it took a year for the study to come about. And they finally came back. The reason it took a year was they had to burn up the $1 million, but that was just the way things go. So it came back, and they said, "Well, we got some bad news for you." They said, "We don't think you can do it. We don't think you can deal with this market." I said, "You need to go find somebody that you can hire to do this job for you." Well, look out there, and I said to myself, anybody we hire is going to be in the business for themselves and not for us. So if we hire somebody, they got a conflict of interest on day one. And what we got to do is we got to find a way to pull this thing together ourselves. Well, you look at the co-op model, and I think the primary example is NRECA. NRECA was put together to manage the relationships with government, mainly lobbying, statewide with state level. And they did it by saying, we're going to work together on this thing. We're all going to get together and we're going to make this work. Then later on, CFC came around because members had trouble finding money, and they filled a gap. And they did it by putting themselves together and coming up with an answer. So ACES looked like, at the time we didn't know the name, but I'll just call it that so we'll know what we're talking about. Anyway, ACES looked like a way for us to put together something on a cooperative basis. And that's the way co-ops solve big problems. They get together and they work together and they collaborate and put their resources together to do what needs to be done. And that's pretty much how the genesis of ACES came about.
So the four original G&Ts that formed ACES are sitting here, and Dick Byrne was part of that. Tim, talk a little bit about, though, some of the controversy and skepticism, because there were like 13 original G&Ts that were part of this program that Ed's describing, but then it narrowed down to 4. As I understand it, 3, and then you got a visit.
Well, actually, the conference call that we were talking about a little bit ago, when it was first organized, was Ed and Roy and I were on the phone, and it took 3 to agree to actually start the organization. So at that point, we had 3, and that's when we told Dick that it was going to form, and he hadn't yet, his board hadn't approved it. So Dick wanted to be president of ACES, and it was agreed that Dick would be the president of ACES, but we had already set a date of when we were going to meet and when we were going to organize, and Dick said, well, I can't get it done, but then said, well, you won't be president, Dick, if you don't get it done. And so Dick found a way to get it done, and when we actually had the meeting, then there were 4 of us, and he was elected chairman. One of the interesting things was that we're a small G&T, and I only had 6 people that actually worked in that department, and 4 of them were union employees that were dispatchers. So when we either lost a unit or we needed to buy power, it was up to those 4 guys to get on the telephone and locate power and purchase it. And we were limited at that time to our interconnects, and we only had 3 interconnects, 2 to IOUs and 1 to Big Rivers. And so until they opened up the transmission, we couldn't go any farther than that. They would block us in all directions. And once the transmission was open, then we realized that there was a whole other world that we could access. But we also realized that we could not, we didn't know what the price of power was or who had it. And so that were two simple things that we were looking to ACES for, was to find out where the power was, what the price of it was, and when we could acquire it, and that you provided for us. But probably one of the things, the $750,000 contribution initially. For a small co-op, $750,000 is a lot of money. And I remember we had a fairly long discussion at our co-op about what they were going to get for $750,000. And back then, it was, I couldn't see everything that was going to happen today. So it was pretty hard to explain some of the simple things that we were going to get. But it had a big future, we thought. So that was why we were interested.
So Roy, there was skepticism by the other G&Ts. There also was skepticism by the employees. Can you talk a little bit about both?
Sure. The skepticism about the employee or from the employees was simply because the whole business model was changing. Employees had been used to operating within their particular G&T with their particular member systems. Everybody was operating on a wholesale power contract, and all at once the world opens up. And so you have day-ahead trading, selling, transmission risks, all the things that we didn't have to use to deal with. And that's really the origin of the ACES name, because all the problems were common to all of us, and so we allied with each other to share resources, including employees, and learn from each other and learn from what this new market was about. So it was natural that there would be skepticism among employees. There was some feeling that we were trying to build a kingdom, some feeling that we were trying to, some people were going to lose their jobs. We actually dispatched employees. I remember East Kentucky Power had employees that went up and worked with Ed, and some went up and worked with Pennsylvania. The market in Pennsylvania was changing a little bit at that time. So it was a learning process. Tim went to work with ACES eventually, and it was understandable because it was really a turmoil in the marketplace at the time. Unlike it is today, things have settled down a little bit, but they'll always be changing. But at that time, we were on the forefront, the cutting edge, and the co-op world was coming into the rest of the power world, and we were no longer sheltered from what we had been used to operating in, and those co-op employees had been trained in that world.
So there were 13 or so G&Ts involved in the original study. 4 chose to start ACES. What happened to the other 8, Ed?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think that they looked at it and said, I don't think these guys know what they're doing. And I think they were right. But we knew we didn't know. That was the big thing. We knew we didn't know. And so they put me in as acting CEO, and let me tell you, I knew I didn't know. And so our first job was to find somebody who did know, and that was you. But in this interim thing, these other guys are looking at it and saying, is this outfit going to work? What are they going to do? How are they going to do it? And we didn't have any answers, really, to tell you the truth. And I think there was legitimate skepticism on people's part as to ACES, and they were just skeptical. The other thing is, an old business adage, never be the first nor the last to get into a new thing. And I think that was one of the underlying sort of thoughts that people had. I never believed that, obviously, but, you know, most people do.
Roy, there were some different business model thought process, so I know some of the 8 chose not to join ACES because they didn't necessarily agree with the direction that the 4 of you took. Is that kind of the way you also saw it?
Yeah, I saw it the same way Ed did. I think it was several different reasons they didn't join. Maybe they didn't understand the market changes as much. They wanted to regress back to the way of we'll do it ourselves, we'll do it alone. I think there were a number of reasons that they didn't join at the time, but over time, obviously, they've come to join. So
Dave Moore, who passed away a few years ago with NRECA, was a constant. He said he made the comment, one of the things he felt the best about one of the things in his career was his support of ACES and helping ACES get started. And I remember too, Dave was very helpful to us. Anyone else come to mind, Tim, that really was kind of on the front end of helping ACES get started?
Well, from SIPC, we had Harold Dicus, who was original board member on ACES. And Harold was a CPA accountant and very outgoing personality and got along well with people. And he helped steer our board in the direction of ACES, particularly the $750,000 and some of the things we needed to do in that area. Interesting thing about Harold, he was on the board of CSC when they hired Sheldon Peterson, and also then part of the board that hired David Tudor here at ACES. So he got to hire 2 of the more influential people with cooperatives. And then, of course, Don Norton, the attorney for Wabash Valley. I've got kind of an interesting story about Don. We were at an early annual meeting, and ACES was the preferred name that we wanted to use. And lo and behold, we found out that somebody else had already had a trademark on the name ACES, and it was some obscure company in the Northwest that did computer programs for something. And so Don had just told me that. We were at the exhibits in the national meeting. And so I said, Don, how big a company is this? And he said, well, I don't think it's very big. And I said, well, generally it's the company's got more money can win on these things. And so we're having this conversation, and lo and behold, a guy walks up and introduces himself that's been standing there listening to us, and he is the owner of that company. So it was a little bit embarrassing, but then on the other hand, he realized that we wanted to use that name. So I think there was some compromise that came about that. and Don was a big part of it. And of course, we came out within ACES Power Marketing.
Sure. Ed, anyone else that you can think of?
Well, I'd like to eulogize Dick Byrne just a little bit.
Sure.
Dick was not easy to get along with. I don't know whether you knew that or not.
I found that out, yeah.
Yeah, but I sure found it out. And trying to deal with Dick was more than a challenge, and I usually lost. But he did bring an aspect to ACES that none of the rest of us could bring. He had had a large variety of very important jobs before he came to Buckeye Power. And he brought a knowledge of how you pay people. And in co-ops, they all, unfortunately, and I think wrongly, the answer has been no more than you have to. But that's not necessarily the best answer, which I'll get to in a second here. So, but Dick came in and said, well, you know, if we're going to make this thing work, we've got to have people that are really capable, and you got to put some money on the table to do it. And he's the one who set up the pay structure for ACES, a very, very powerful answer for us. And he also brought up I think he pushed hard for not going in and buying power in ACES name, but in the general, let the G&Ts be the owners of the power. And that turned out to be an enormously important answer with respect to the formation of ACES and the development of ACES, because without it, we'd have been stuck a long time ago with 4 members. But I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit. Mm-hmm. And Don Morton, my good friend Don Morton, you said a little bit about him, but he basically put down the legal foundation for ACES. And he did it working with a bunch of G&T lawyers. And that is just like herding cats. I mean, it was tough. But he did it, and we got it done, so I got to give him kudos for that.
Well, I was a little naive back then, and maybe still today, but when I went through the interview process, I was doing everything I could to actually not get the job. I did not really want to move to Indiana. My wife absolutely had no interest in moving to Indiana. And so I was trying to help and help them find the right candidate, but I really just wanted a consulting deal. And I remember after my second interview, I'd gone to the airport and Dick Byrne called me, and I'd seen the original business plan. I'd seen the compensation structure that was in the business plan, and I knew what I was doing from a consulting standpoint, and I really didn't want the job. And so Dick contacted me and said, we'd like to offer you the job. And I said, well, Dick, I think I've been clear. I really don't want to move to Indiana. And he said, well, you haven't even heard the proposal yet. And I said, well, I'm not sure you guys understand that if you're going to really be successful, you've got to be able to pay people right. And in this energy, in the energy trading business, and I'm looking at the budget, and you're just not going to get there. So whoever's going to take this position is not going to be able to hire the right talent. And Dick said, young man, until you heard my offer, I suggest you shut up. So that was the first time I learned the same thing Ed did, is Dick was sometimes hard to get along with. Moving on, I wasn't supposed to tell any stories today, but I couldn't hold that one back. This concept of, originally, ACES was formed to trade speculatively and to compete with Enron and other Williams and other energy trading companies. And then along the, early on, ACES board and management decided to use this concept of trading as agent for its members. Can you talk a little bit about that, Roy?
Sure. The concept we originally looked at was simply because everybody else was doing it. That was the model that seemed popular at the time. But the more we analyze that model, the more we realize there's a lot of risk in that, risk to everybody. And so by trading as agent, the transactions between ACES and the particular individual co-op. So that lessened the risk, and I think lessened some of the angst, the anxieties of what we were doing. I think it was a wise move to go that route because of the risk involved.
So along the way, there were some pivotal moments in those first few years where there was a chance that ACES was actually not going to make it. In fact, if I recall, there was a clause where the members could vote to shut ACES down after a certain time period. But there were some windows of time where I'm sure each of you thought, have we really made the right decision here? Any particular time come to mind, Tim, where you thought, well, we've made a mistake and we may have to unwind this?
I think at the G&T managers meeting that we had in Lexington is one of the times that stands out to me. ACES was newly formed, and you were the president of ACES, and we were going to make a presentation. And I think David made the presentation at the G&T managers meeting. And I thought that there would probably be a good discussion and people would be interested. But I was pretty well shocked that there were some very vocal people at that meeting that were opposed. And I didn't expect that at all. And having thought about it later, it hadn't been too many years before that where they'd allowed vendors to come in and they paid for different things, and they'd gotten away from that. They said, we don't want anybody in here that's furnishing anything. We want to be by ourselves and be able to share our experiences and learn things that are going on. So I think some of them could have taken it that we were there trying to sell something and trying to make money, even though that was not our intent. And there were 2 or 3 people that were very vocal. So later that evening, after it was all over with, we had dinner together. And I think it opened all of our eyes a little bit as to what kind of challenges we had. And then there was one other time, and that was at an NRECA annual meeting where we had kind of an open house reception. And we invited all the G&T cooperatives to come. And outside of the 4 of us and some of our directors, there weren't very many people that came to that one. So those 2 were a little discouraging.
Well, oddly enough, as you know, of course, I now work at Associated, and probably the most vocal that day and actually kicked me out of the G&T Managers Association was a gentleman named Don Shaw, who's retired, and he's a director of at Associated and was the CEO of Central Electric. And so I have some fun with Don because he attends many of our meetings, and we have some good laughs about that day. He kicked me out of the G&T Managers Association meeting. Anything else come to mind, Ed, where there's some times where ACES, might have failed?
I hadn't thought about Don Shaw in a long time. He was a character, man. He was just hard-nosed as he could be about anything that he came up with that he thought was right. And we just had to deal with that guy.
I think he and Dick Byrne got along pretty well.
That's about right. No, it was just tough all around when you're dealing with those things. I went down and talked to the lawyers, of all things. I think Don Morton got me into it, fortunately, and I got up and made a pitch. I only had 5 minutes to talk about ACES, and it just wasn't very long. And at the end of the thing, it was stone silence, nothing. And I said, boy, to myself, we're not getting anywhere with this group. And we didn't get anywhere with that group because they thought of every reason in the world why it just wouldn't work. And so we had to fight that problem, and really Don and the other lawyers involved in the thing had to fight the problem with the other lawyers in the G&Ts to sort of get enough confidence from their side to tell their CEOs, well, you can look at it. And that's about as far as they would go. You can look at it. But, yeah, it was tough.
So let's turn this a little bit towards, well, first of all, ACES, through those years, has become highly successful and started with 4 and, made the effort to grow and add additional G&Ts. And Steve, I know you were along, you're the only, I think, remaining director from the original ACES board.
That's correct.
So ACES has grown from 4 to 21, and along the way, obviously, there's been some challenges. And can you just talk a little bit about that window of time from 4 to 21, because you've seen every bit of it?
Yeah, I think when we started, the 4 had a common goal. We wanted to see an organization start, probably didn't know what it was, so we got along well. I mean, there probably was discussion in the background. I didn't hear maybe things, but I didn't see it in our meetings that we had. And I think it was a goal to, make an organization grow and prosper for the co-ops. I do remember that growing from 4 to 21, we probably had no idea we would grow to where we're at today. I just don't see that. One of the things I see is that the operating agreement we had, it was long, it was probably too complicated in my mind, those kind of things. But one of the things we do have in there is that from the original was that you had to have a unanimous vote to add members. And so that kind of shows you there could have been some problems there, whatever, and it was put in there, and it's still in there today, that we still have to have a unanimous vote from 42 people to add a member. And adding members has always been good. It brings in capital, brings in new ideas, diversity from Texas to California to Ohio or to Indiana, wherever it is. So it's been good for us, still trying to add members.
Thank you. So Roy, let's talk a little bit about ACES and how they've increased their services, because it started out really with just real-time transactions as agent, and over the years they've gone from a few services to over 60. So what was the board's vision and the thought process in terms of adding services, and what was the whole strategy there?
Well, I remember we went through a debate whether ACES would be a car, a train, or an airplane. I mean, in other words, how large did we want to get? How powerful did we want to try to make the services in behalf of the members? And looking back from the four GNTs who organized ACES to where we are today, I would now say that ACES is a fighter jet. It's gone far beyond where we ever anticipated. And it grew because the market kept changing. The risk that I described a while ago kept being more and more and more. The risk kept being more. I heard the term hedge.
Sure.
I thought a hedge was a row of plants out in my front yard. That was not right. It's how you manage risk, how you counterbalance a risk, if you will. So we all started learning. And where it is today is nothing like we ever envisioned. And I guess the thing that I remember most is how much faith and confidence the boards had in the four CEOs who kept preaching the sermon about ACES. We went to them, we asked, we put together $1 million originally. We came back and we said we need another $750,000. And there was a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, but there was a lot of faith. And it was on me as a CEO at East Kentucky Power to be sure that I worked with these other gentlemen to prove that what we were concerned about was in fact valid. That's sort of how I see ACES growing and where we are today. And I'll talk a little bit about the future in a minute, but it's going to continue to change.
Ed, same question. Service, capabilities, growth, how ACES grew. Maybe talk a little bit about Co-ops of America.
Well, I'm not going to talk a lot about Co-ops of America.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I didn't like the question, so I'm not going to do that.
That's right.
But
That's what key leaders do. They answer the question they want to answer.
that's the way it is, buddy.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, I will tell you that what really made ACES go forward was you. And you came forward with a very positive attitude, and you said, I know what I'm doing. I don't know whether you did or not, but you said you knew what you were doing. and we all believed you, and we supported you. And you came up with the ideas that allowed us to put in staff that was possible. I did want to say that when we started ACES, Wabash Valley Power moved about 20-something people into ACES Power Marketing. And as CEO, I want to tell you, I felt every loss of it, because all of a sudden I didn't have these people anymore, and I had to go find more. You might say, well, you cut down your costs. No, I didn't. I had to go pay more to get new ones. But you came in and you organized the thing and really came forward with a positive attitude, and I think that's what really made the big difference.
Thank you.
So we can do this thing.
Yeah. So just off script a little bit, I think we have a moment. And so, Tim, you had, operations, with physical plants. East Kentucky had plants and wires. Buckeye was basically a partner with AEP, and really AEP operated their plants and no transmission, and then Wabash had pieces of power supply and pieces of plants. So 4 completely different G&Ts. I don't know if the audience realizes it, but the 4 operations, very different, but somehow you all saw the value in forming this entity. And, you know, is just a couple of comments maybe on that, Ed, if you don't mind.
I don't understand that. Tell me again now.
Well, I'll hand it off to Roy. He looked like he was smiling.
Well, from my standpoint, I think the diversity of our system makeups really represented the market, because the market was changing so much that all the components you just described, David, that was somewhere among the 4 of us, were part of the changes in the marketplace. And so being able to have the diversity among us to look at the marketplace and reflect on what we were doing as a company, I think was helpful. I think the diversity among our systems was helpful to me in understanding what was going on in the marketplace.
Well, what I was getting at too is that basically Tim outsourced the operations. Ed donated people. East Kentucky Power donated people and systems. And Buckeye actually had ACES help them with their contractual negotiations with AEP. So different services for each of you, all kind of bundled into one entity. That's really what I was.
So if I may add one other thing off script too. There was a huge education effort. It was educate, educate, educate. Talk about the market, what was changing in the market, how it could impact our system, how the money that we were being asked to invest would eventually come back and pay benefits to our members. There was a huge education component to what we did years ago.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yes, sir.
One of the early things that you did, David, that when ACES was originally set up, we were allowed actually to speculate in the market. And I didn't really know how that was going to work or how we were going to do it exactly, but obviously there's a market there, you can make money on it. And one of the first things David did when he came in and looked at our organizations is he said, you people don't need to be speculating in the market. You don't want to risk your members' money. So that was one of the very first things we did, and we all agreed that that was not a good idea, and we stopped that. And then very shortly after that, we added one of our new services. That's when we found out there were people out there selling power, and basically all they were a desk and a telephone. They had no assets. They would go buy power and then turn around and resell it. And when the price started going up one summer, when price got really high, they were going to the market and buying it and then turn around and selling it. Well, they could no longer afford to buy it, and they defaulted on their contracts. And so right then we decided we had to have a credit department, and you hired credit people to make sure that when we did a transaction with somebody, they were able to back up the transaction with actual money.
Excellent. Thank you. So ACES has been very successful. The 4 of you have been involved in it, starting it. You've watched it grow. You've participated in its growth. How do you think that? And what advice would you give to Mike and his team and the other members of ACES? How does ACES remain relevant? I mean, what is it that ACES needs to continue to do to be successful? And start with you, Roy.
Well, I think not just for ACES, but for everybody in this room, for your systems. One thing I would say to you is don't fear the future. Our business is going to continue to change. It's always changed. It's never been static. Edison's first system was all batteries. Now we know what the grid is. The next thing that we're going to have to deal with is storage, for example. Do we have batteries that we treat as resources? Do we have other kinds of storage? If we treat it as a resource, how do we price it? Because it functions as a resource, any other kind of resource is like that. We have peaking, we have shaving, we have capacity, we have energy. So that may be the next thing we have to deal with. The point I'm making is don't fear the future. And for ACES, I would say watch out for the future, watch out how it impacts the systems, do what you do best, and that's plan accordingly and help the members face those challenges without fear and with as minimal risk as possible.
So, Steve, you've been with ACES from the beginning, on the board the entire time. And so you've watched this entire growth pattern. So you're probably in a really good position to kind of think for them what do they need to do. What's the next step, in ACES' future?
Yeah, I think it's going to be vital for the co-ops. I think people's already joined. I can give you an example for Buckeye. I think that the groundwork's already there, the way it was formed, the controls that's in place, the purpose for co-ops. For Buckeye, I think we talked about Dick. Dick actually was committed to ACES. It was one of the things that he thought that everyone needed and Buckeye needed. Now, we didn't take many services at the time, but he was still convinced, and the board, paid their fees and those kind of things. And I don't know if you know this now or not, but things have changed with AEP with us. A year from today, the only coal-fired power plant they'll have in Ohio is the one unit that's at our power plant. And they're not running the power plant now. It's Buckeye's running the plant as of about a year ago. So it's some big changes for us, and ACES has been there to help us. And actually, they started a new service. They're ready for changes, and I think that's what it is. The industry's changing. The new service is a generation operation for us, and they built a whole new complex for us. And hopefully other people's going to use the same thing as we are, and they're talking about transmission the same way. So I think it's ready for the future.
Awesome. So I want to ask each of you, you've each had very successful careers in your own G&Ts and sit on other boards, and I'll start with Tim, but what kind of advice would you give to the cooperative world? And when I say the world, I mean the distribution systems and the G&Ts around just the forming of ACES and the success it's had. But what's some of the from your perspective, what you've learned along the way, maybe some tricks of the trade?
I'm not sure I'm an expert on this one, but I think we were fortunate that we were able to start small, and so I wouldn't be afraid to start small. Not everybody's going to agree, particularly CEOs of G&T co-ops. It's a very difficult thing to get them to come to an agreement. So if you have to start small, that sometimes can lead to big things. I think that's the one thing I'd say. Don't be afraid to start with a small group.
So maybe some final comments, Ed?
Well, I do. I got several, actually.
All right.
I look out to the future of the electric utility business, not just co-ops, but the electric utility business. And over the next 10, maybe 15 years, maybe less, but at least 10 to 15 years, we're looking at enormous changes at the distribution level. The ideas of distributed generation are present, and they're going to continue. They're not going to go away. So the systems that we built, and I did this in my early career, the systems that we built were radial systems, and they were one-directional. And now we're coming up, and some people could put in large quantities of electric power on a distributed basis. And how do you manage that? I don't think anybody's got a real finger on exactly how to do that yet. But some way, working with your G&Ts, you need to come up with a collective answer. You don't need to everybody go out and solve this thing by yourselves, because frankly, it's just too complex to get it done by yourselves. You need to collectively work on the thing, and ACES can provide a lot of expertise in that area to help you out. Because as you look out to the future, as I said in an earlier comment, co-ops solve things by working together. That's how you get it done. That's how you solve the big problems that you face. You faced it with the generation and transmission answers through G&Ts, and you got to face this now with this distributed generation with the G&Ts. You can't do it by yourselves. And I think the G&Ts have got to look to ACES for a lot of expertise in order to how to do this. And we need an answer, a single answer to this thing. We don't need 10 answers out there. We need a single answer.
Steve?
Well, I guess I'm a little different. I'm a distribution manager, and we have to wear a lot of different hats. You have to deal with a lot of things, from power supply to employees to board members to the community to all those kind of things. So you have to make decisions based on a lot of things. And I think I've been fortunate. I've been chairman of Buckeye Power for 23 years, so I get to see a lot of things that other people don't. I've been involved with ACES from the beginning, seeing a lot of information, So my advice would be, absorb all the information you can. You can't be experts on everything, but try and get all that information from everywhere, from ACES to NRECA, whoever it might be, and help you make informed decisions.
Excellent. Roy, final thoughts?
Yes, but the final thought I have is that treasure the co-op model. The co-op model is very versatile. It's adaptable. It's proven itself in different circumstances, and it'll continue to serve us well. So be proud that you're part of the co-op model, and look to that co-op model to serve your future needs.
Well, each of you have been really good to me for a long, long time, and including Dick Byrne. I wish he could have been with us today. Dick did a lot of things for behind the scenes. I agree with you, Steve, that people don't even know he did to support the organization. We sat at the table together with some others along the way. So it was my pleasure, actually, to be involved, and very fortunate in my career that I stumbled into the cooperative program. And then I left for 3 years and came back, and those 3 years were really interesting. And I missed it. I missed the camaraderie. I missed the family components of being with the cooperatives. I agree with your concerns, Ed. There are some challenges out there, but our model has survived floods and tornadoes and Enron and a meltdown of our economy. And along the way, if you think of any catastrophe that's occurred through the years, the cooperative model continues to survive and thrive. And I think that's something we always need to keep in mind as we make the changes to address the markets. So I'll kind of give you one more shot. Tim, anything you want to, any of you, but I kind of left you out. Any final comments you'd like to make?
Well, I guess I agree with all of them that the cooperative concept is an excellent way of doing business, and it's worked since the early 30s, and it continues to evolve today in all the new types of green power movements we see, and I think that's one of the threats that I see on the horizon. Illinois, basically Chicago, has already passed an ordinance where they're going to go totally green. And we all know that that's not possible to be 100% that way. But there are a lot of people that believe that can happen. And so we're going to need co-ops to steer them in the right direction, because it's really, you can't have 100% green. You maybe have a very high percentage, but not 100%. So I think the model will continue to survive.
Excellent. So we have just a little about over 5 minutes, and I'm guessing maybe there's someone in the audience who'd like to ask a question of one of our panelists. Is there? We can't see if hands are up, so the ACES people will have to help if there's anyone who has a question. Still can't see. Oh, here we go.
I'd like to ask one. I'm Pat McCullough with Delaware Municipal Electric Corporation out in the state of Delaware. I stepped into this energy industry in 1992, thank you, right when the Energy Policy Act had just been formed. Federal Power Commission was turning into the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They were issuing Order 888. They wanted to stand up these things called RTOs to manage markets and everything. And so when I was stepping in here and I was building the company, that's what I was brought in to do. And suddenly I realized that all the people that had worked in the industry and had all this experience were experiencing shock with the new market structures coming in. And they were all retiring. There was a massive exodus going on. And I wanted to ask you how you guys addressed that, because I'm sure you had that experience at that time too, and how you addressed that.
We started ACES. I think that was it, and we worked together. I mean, that's the biggest thing that I see. If co-ops are going to survive, you have to work together. If you're out there fragmented and doing it this way and that way and the other, they're going to pick you apart. This is not an easy world. This is a tough world, and the more competition you get, the tougher it gets. And we're headed into competition in all aspects of this business.
Well, we didn't talk about it today so far, Pat runs an organization that is a customer of ACES, and so ACES provides services to its members, but there's a component of ACES that's also provides services to third parties that are not members. Has always treated them the same, and what's happened is, that business model of as agent, we found worked for other organizations that are similar, whether they be municipals or joint action agencies or et cetera. Maybe just a follow-on to that, Roy, kind of how important was that customer business to ACES in the early years and from a revenue perspective?
From a revenue perspective, as I remember it, that wasn't the original purpose. It was to serve the G&Ts, co-ops. And over the years, the customer aspect has grown more and more and more, and I think has really helped ACES thrive. I think not only does it help ACES, it helps the customer, and it shows the value of ACES to everybody, that we can also serve third parties. I think it's a tremendous step forward in doing that. Back to your question, Pat, one thing I'm thinking as you were asking the question, unfortunately, a lot of us had to learn the hard way. And as employees grew in their knowledge base from their knocks and bumps in the marketplace, we learned more how the importance of educating employees, of training employees, of succession planning around issues became important. So we sort of learned the hard way, but your point is right on. And it's going to be more important as the market unfolds more and more as we go into the future, that we have trained employees. We're into a focus now, or phase where we are a lot of retirements, and not only were we dealing with new issues, we're dealing with new technology. So there's a lot of new education, new training, and new focus needs to be put on employees.
I'd like to thank our panelists. It's been a pleasure working with all of you through the years. I'm honored to have been asked by ACES to join you today. I really appreciate your perspective. I'm so happy that all of you are healthy and staying in the business, and you've got friends and family here. This has been a great experience. I really do appreciate it. So if you'd thank our panelists.
Thank you, David. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.